Great. All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you all for being here for what is a very important and timely talk. So I'm Daniella Farah. I'm a PhD candidate in Jewish history at Stanford. And this talk is the fourth of a series of lectures, the fourth and final of a series of lectures for a course I'm teaching called The Jews of the Modern Middle East and North Africa. And so before I introduce Professor Roby, I'd like to mention that among the panelists are my students, and I think a couple more of them will be joining. So I'm going to turn to them first to ask questions, and then I'll turn to the audience to ask questions. Please type your question directly into the Q&A box. And okay, so it's with great pleasure that I introduce Professor Bryan K. Roby. Dr. Roby is an assistant professor of Judaic and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. His expertise is on 20th century Israeli and North African Jewish history. His research and teaching interests include Jewish racial constructs, policing, and civil rights globally, and 19th and 20th century North African history. Professor Roby has written extensively on social justice protests in Israel. His first book, The Mizrahi Era of Rebellion, Israel's Forgotten Civil Rights Struggle, 1948 to 1966, was published in 2015 with Syracuse University Press. Professor Roby is currently working on a second book project called Israel Through a Colored Lens, Racial Constructs in the Israeli Jewish Imagination. It explores the shifting boundaries of racial constructs in Israel-Palestine, as well as African-American intellectual contributions to Israeli sociology and theories on race and ethnicity. This talk will explore how and why Afro-Asian Jews in Israel became associated and engaged with global Black thought throughout the 20th century. Without further ado, Professor Roby.
All right, thanks for having me and thanks for that wonderful introduction. As Daniella Farah pointed out, I'm talking mostly about my book. This is kind of the layout. I'll be primarily talking about chapters 2 and 4, mapping the Black body, Jews in the service of empire, as well as Israel through a color lens, both of which kind of play upon each other in ways that kind of show how Mizrahim or Afro-Asian Jews in Israel became Black through what I call epistemological violence. So the production of knowledge that was created quite violent consequences as a result. In general, race in an Israeli Jewish context is kind of divided into 2 or 3 categories, with Ashkenazim or European origin Jews being the kind of white Jewish class, maintaining most of the political and socioeconomic power, Mizrahim being associated with Blackness. This is a diverse group of Afro-Asian origin Jews from as far west as Morocco and as far east as Singapore, India, Pakistan, places like that, were most migrated to Israel in the 1950s to the 1970s. And then there's the Beta Israel category, who are have Blackness imposed upon them, but was not necessarily how they identified themselves. Until the current generation, which is the second generation, with many or most migrating in the late 70s until the 90s. So that's just like a little bit of context so you'll know who and what I'm talking about as I'm going through this. What I'll do is I'll kind of conclude with some reflections on how our understandings of Israeli Jewish racial constructs influence current day societal issues, and I welcome any questions that may have been sparked as I'm talking, even though I'm not talking that much about today in that sense. At the heart of my research, I deal with this question of, if we say that race is a social construct, then what are those building blocks that created it? How do these racial constructs are formed and then change over time and place? So I'm going beyond this question of, are the Jews of a race? Instead, kind of dealing with the implications of understanding the processes involved with creating a black, white, brown color line between Jews only and explicitly through this exploration of the shifting boundaries over time. Okay, so first off, I'll talk about a little bit about Ida Jiggets, a Black scholar that I've written about and hopefully will soon publish an article on, who kind of serves as this Janus figure in the book, in which she goes to Israel in the 1950s, but she allows us to actually look back at the construction of Mizrahim as Black in the early 20th century. And then I'll return in the second part to the 1950s to show how Black Americans in particular produced knowledge about Mizrahim, or at that time as they were called, Oriental Jews, and were themselves influenced by the Afro-Asian Jewish struggle in Israel for civil rights. And in the third part, I move on to the 1970s that deals with this forgotten scandal involving the migration of Moroccan and Iraqi Israeli Jews to Morocco and Iraq, and how they used the Black Panthers, as well as Blackness in general, global Blackness, as a framework for empowerment and self-understanding. Okay, so another little caveat I'll say is that, it's really important to understand that Blackness can't be located on the body because of the diversity of bodies that claim Blackness as an identity. And if we try to locate Blackness on the body, so that, generally speaking in the US, we talk about skin color or nose or mouth shape and face shapes and things like that. A lot of that really just reproduces very problematic biological determinism that, is created by scientific racism. And, as scholars in the 21st century, I'd like us to move beyond that. So that's just something that's really important to get into. Okay, so Ida Jiggets, born in North Carolina, she writes a memoir called Israel to Me. And throughout it, she talks about her difficulty in understanding how she's racially marked in ways that are very different from the way that she's marked in the US. She's often mistaken for being a Yemenite Jew. And she recalled one incident in particular where she's walking down the street in Jerusalem and she heard children yelling, "Kushi, Kushi." And it's a Hebrew word that has the strength and ugliness of the N-word for Americans. And she assumed that they were talking to her. So she grabbed one of the boys to scold him. And she asked the boy, "Well, why did you call me this? Don't you know that's rude?" And he said, "I wasn't calling you a Kushi, I was calling him a Kushi," as he pointed to a dark-skinned Yemenite Jewish boy. The blonde-haired child who had said this turned out to be the son of American parents and had from an early young age easily translated understandings of Blackness in the US to that of Yemenite Jews in Israel. So how did he learn this word, and why did he think it appropriate to call Yemenite Jews Kushi in that sense? Sorry. Oh, there's some things out of order here, but that's okay. So if we really want to get into that, how Afro-Asian Jews became Black, I argue that rather than imposing an American category onto an Israeli society, there's actually this transnational conversation about race that's taking place. In an Israeli case, there's this epistemological violence at play in which the triangulation of American, German, and Zionist notions of Blackness helped to invent the category of Mizrahim itself. And so with that in particular, I want to talk about some of the intellectuals at play. And one in particular that I'm going to talk about today deals with North African Jews. The main figures I would say are Arthur Rupin, who is a German social Darwinist and very engaged with scientific racism. He's the foundational Jewish demographer. So the Central Bureau of Statistics, as well as how we perceive of Jewish demography now, the study of it is really kind of shaped by him in the beginning. Nahom Shalush is an ethnohistorian, archaeologist, and on the side, he's working as a French colonial spy, while also working for the Jewish Territory Organization, looking for land as an alternative to Palestine. The third, Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, second president of Israel, is an ethnographer of Jews in Palestine. And of course, Shlomo D. Goiten is a German ethnographer of Jews in the Arabian Peninsula. Each one of these figures kind of take a chunk of land where Jews are living and produce like the kind of authoritative knowledge about them and their history, what they're like, who they are, whether or not they're modern or civilized and things like that. And they really do shape American, European, and Israeli notions of race for Afro-Asian Jews. So Nahom Shalush, he, during this period of time, so this is around the 1910s, where he is, he's working for he's working for three different empires: the Ottoman Empire, the French and British Empire between 1902 and 1914. And through them, we get a glimpse into how some European Jewry understood the racialized others of Afro-Asian Jews. And this is all slightly part of the Uganda plan, if anyone's heard of it, but at this time, they're looking at both Babylonia, or current-day Iraq, and Cyrenaica, current-day Libya, as alternatives because they're actually ripe with myth-making rhetoric about ancient Jewish homelands. And so this figure, Nahum Shalosh, known as the Marco Polo of Hebrew literature, carry out numerous scientific missions on behalf of the French and Ottoman government until the dismantlement of the Ottoman Empire, as well as the auspices of Zionist institutions. And a large theme throughout his work is looking for the primordial origins of the Jewish people, as well as Jewish ties to the lands of the Middle East and Africa. What he found exciting was not the Jewish people of North Africa, with whom he depicted with disgust, but the ability of pre-modern Jewish history to recreate a glorious past of valor and strength, both in the Roman era and in Andalusian Spain. So when he's talking about North African Jews, he calls them all kinds of things, but then he refers to this glorious past and says things like that ancient Jewish warrior past, through their influence, quote, is to be met with throughout the entire Atlas in Ethiopia and the Sudan, where the descendants of Jews of Cyrenaica founded empires, Judaized the natives, and civilized the country. Neither Greeks nor Romans nor Arabs have succeeded in repeopling it again. It is as though it were awaiting its valiant Jewish aboriginals. There are such striking similarities between how he's depicting North Africa in search for Jewish homeland and how other Zionists were depicting Palestine at the time. You know, this kind of idea of a land without a people, and that the ancient Jewish past should be the people who repeople those lands in that sense. When he actually met with North African Jews, he took note of the strength and virility of the men, commenting that they were, quote, well-built, fine specimens of humanity. But the one idea that possessed me was how to keep them away from getting too close to me. He went on to describe Libyan Jews as grimy urchins with little brown girls half naked. I'm sorry, 1 second. I have to move my screen a little bit around because there's a little issue here. Okay, that is much better. Okay. Little brown girls half naked, their black eyes flashed out of black circles composed of flies that clung to them without causing them any discomfort, as if this was, you know, a normal thing in that sense. This is the scourge of the African Jew, caused by his disregard of even the elements of cleanliness and by constant exposure to sand and sun. So such writings from Shalosh translated into practice through the institution of selective immigration policies during the British Mandate period in Palestine, where North Africans were often turned away from migration to Palestine due to assumptions that they suffered from sexual diseases, mental health issues, and trachoma, which is a form of eye disease. And it's also important to note that Arthur Rupin, who I'm not talking about too much, is actually pivotal in shaping those selective immigration policies at this time. And Nahum Shalosh is actually informing him about what, you know, who to be wary of in terms of who to bring in. Underlying his text, which was called Travels in North Africa, translated into numerous languages, including English, is an early 20th century scientific racialist understanding of North African Jews. He's intent on discovering which communities in particular are able-bodied enough to be natural manual laborers, so that Eastern European Jews may later settle parts of Libya and Morocco. I can't emphasize enough how explicit he was in this, and it's fairly disturbing throughout to read. At its core, it's a work that not only describes the racial differences between Ashkenazi and Mizrahi Jews, but also depicts his search for Black and brown Jewish bodies who could work the land of North Africa should the settlement of Palestine not work out. For Jewish men, he pointed to their virility and strength and sometimes homoerotic undertones, while for Moroccan women, he often lauded their cleanliness and lighter skin tones in relation to the simple-minded and darker men. It's this blatant search for Black and brown bodies for labor that put him at odds with the Alliance Israélite Universelle, who eventually convinced the French colonial administration to kick him out of Morocco. Much like the W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington schism among Black Americans at the time, the Alliance thought that the Jews of the region should be civilized, so they still went along with the civilization rhetoric, but it was through education and business acumen, while Shalosh thought it best to train them in vocational training and agricultural work. This flavored the discourse surrounding their arrival to Israel with the assumption that they would be a burden on the state. Moreover, with his wild tales of blood vendettas carried out by bloodthirsty Moroccan Jewish men with knives and sexy, semi-nude Jewish women, he paints a picture of North African Jews in particular that persisted in Zionist thought even before their large-scale arrival in Israel. And if anyone's familiar with some of the stereotypes of in the 50s, Moroccan Jews, they were oftentimes called Morocai Sakin, like Moroccans with knives, and a lot of that comes directly from the Shalosh's depictions. Following his expedition to Morocco, he also held conferences throughout the US, and most importantly, earns the praise of Maurice Fishberg, an American Jewish anthropologist who publishes this book on the left, The Jews, A Study of Race and Environment. Fishberg's main point was to prove once and for all that the Jews did not constitute a unified race. And as such, the European Jews were capable of being integrated into Anglo-Saxon society. In many ways, Afro-Asian Jews acted as a Black foil to uphold Ashkenazi Jewish whiteness. In doing so, he produced a work that outlines racial differences between Jews worldwide in the 20th century for an Anglophone audience. So we can already see that with Shalosh working with the French colonial government, as well as British Mandate Palestine and the Zionist organization in Palestine, and in the US, there's this transnational conversation that does not involve Afro-Asian Jews themselves, but it is about them. In his treatment of North African Jews, you can see on the right-hand side, he describes this woman as a fat Jewess in Tunis in native costume. And he also takes note that many of them were, quote, of Negroid type, showing a decided Negro infusion. And that based on their nose and head shape, Jews in North Africa and Yemen can be assumed that their origins are about the same as the origin of Negroid traits among their non-Jewish neighbors in those countries. So slightly or implicitly questioning their Jewishness in some ways, or racial purity for their Jewishness. After describing the measurements of their heads and noses, he cites the work of Shalosh in stating that, quote, the most interesting of North Africans are the cave dwellers of Tripoli, on the slopes of which is a caravan from the Mediterranean to the Sudan. There are found many Jewish troglodytes. Strikingly similar depictions of Jews in Yemen and Iraq and Mandate Palestine are found within the writings of Yitzhak ben Zvi and Shlomo Goiten, two Orientalist Jewish travel writers, the former of which was the second president of Israel. These sorts of depictions created an image of the North African Jew as prehistoric cave dwellers, both for American and European Zionist audience within the Yishuv, a sentiment that unfortunately still persists today. I want to pause for a second because these are postcards here that I'm still working through. I find them so fascinating. In particular, the one on the left and the one on the far right. These are the same women or the same teenage girl, right? And in these postcards that are produced in France by a variety of different photographers, on the left-hand side, we see that she's labeled as an Arab woman, and she has a specific type of pose with her hands behind her head. Right next to her is something similar that I found where she's described as a person is described as a Moorish woman with the same stance. And then we have the Jewish kind of stance where women put their hands on the side of their hips, or they're made to for these photos. And on the right-hand side, the same woman, or the same girl is doing this stance, and she's described as a Jewish woman. I know because of the conical hat that she's wearing, that she's actually a Jewish teenager at this age, but it's very striking that just a different pose kind of changes their categories of ethnicity and race in that sense. With Jewish women being depicted as generally somewhat lighter many times, but also, in the middle there, a woman is smoking cigarettes. They look a little bit more assertive than the hypersexual depictions of Muslim women and Amazigh women as well. Okay, so these types of epistemological violence travel with ease amongst those unfamiliar with the Middle East. They were mediated by these experts seeking to advance a sort of savior narrative that emerged in the context of mass migration. For instance, just going to go back because this might be distracting to you guys. For instance, from 1941 to 1951, nearly 50,000 Jews from the Arabian Peninsula migrated to the state of Israel with the assistance of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, British and local Muslim authorities, the State of Israel, and the Jewish Agency, known as Operation Magic Carpet. This large-scale migration of the Jewish population to Israel holds a significant place in Zionist historiography, which frames it as an exodus, an Israeli redemption of naive, primitive, and overly religious Jews. Recently, I discovered at the American Jewish Archives a recorded interview with one of the American pilots who flew this mission. His name was Moran Metzger, and he participated in the first stages of Operation Magic Carpet. He recalls that he was told by Israeli authorities that the Yemenite Jews had never lived in houses and were, quote, so incredibly nomadic, whatever that means, having never lived in anything but a tent. With the flight crew of 20, he used the C-46 aircraft. He made over a dozen 9-hour flights from November 48 to March 49. And he admitted that he was uninformed on Yemenite society, but spoke a lot with his Israeli liaisons prior to his arrival. When he asked about the purpose of the trip, he was told that he was, quote, redeeming one of the lost tribes of Israel who were being slaughtered in Yemen. And, quote, they would have had their throats cut in an Arab society that was nothing in comparison to anything we know in civilization. And of course, I shouldn't have to say it, but I feel like I should, or I need to, that of course, those who were awaiting transportation to Israel had been placed in these tents in the British Crown colony of Aden. And these camps were built and supervised by the State of Israel, along with the Jewish Distribution Committee. They suffered from a mismanagement at a scale that resulted in the deaths of hundreds of Jews from starvation and illness at this time. So these weren't their natural homes. They were placed in these tents. Is the point. And I'm contending, my main point for this part is that as Orientalists, they were largely responsible for the production of European Jewish knowledge of Afro-Asian Jews. As such, many of the stereotypes surrounding North African Jews, as well as Yemenite Jews in Israel, stem from these understandings of a global Negro in that sense, as well as Ashkenazi Jewish anthropological investigations into the existence of a Jewish race, and colonial French narratives concerning North African masculinity and femininity. Delving into these divisions unearths a powerful racial dynamic in which there are clear hierarchies at play of Jewish racial difference that play out in similar yet informationally variant ways to Black-white divisions in the US. And the perspectives of these Orientalists at the time shaped Black scholar Ida Jiggets' presentation of the ethnic demon in Israel, when she travels there in 1950. So returning to Jiggets, she's a young Black social worker and NYU PhD student who enrolled at the Hebrew U in Jerusalem in 1951 as part of a trip sponsored by New York University's Israel workshop. And this was all part of her dissertation, which was meant to be about the integration of Yemenite Jews in Israeli society. Her work in Israel comes within the context of Black internationalism, which from the 1940s to the 1960s saw many Black American scholars, activists, and artists from James Baldwin to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. make plans or actually visit Israel. At this point, Black visitors saw affinities more with Afro-Asian Jews as part of the global Black community, and were actually more concerned with their struggles of Afro-Asian Jews in Israeli society, and a lot less so with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. While there, Jiggets was, of course, privy to a historical moment in which Jews from a wide-ranging socioeconomic backgrounds, but from the global South, were largely housed in tent camps. Right, that's the part that's out of order. There we go. Here we go. All right. So these are some images of Mabarot or transit camps. There are many issues with these camps, including the devastating shift to a rural lifestyle for Middle Eastern immigrants, who were accustomed to a middle-class urban lifestyle, forced settlement, and curfews within fenced compounds, rampant unemployment, rationing of food, and lack of access to clean water or transportation, which I talk about a lot in my first book. They were later used as a tool of social control developed by the state and police and helped to create a segregated society with Mizrahi Jews living in the periphery and Ashkenazi Jews in the center. So if we take a look at these maps that I've created, the little V-shaped things are where Marlborough were placed in. And it's just a screenshot of a more dynamic map. But you can see that, for instance, if we zoom into Tel Aviv Yafo, they're all around the city, right? They're not within the city itself. And very similar things, but they are, mostly around these peripheral areas of various different parts of the country. There is a map later where you'll see that this actually maps on quite explicitly to the same kind of geographic distribution of Afro-origin Jews in 2011. So many of these Jews still remain in the same kind of towns where these Marlborough were. As I was working on my first book and documenting the history of the protest against these conditions and for equality, what fascinated me about these protests were how they were influenced in both tactics and rhetoric by a variety of global people of color struggles, including those of Gandhi in India, Afro-Arab anti-colonial liberation movements, and most importantly, the African-American civil rights struggle. Can you let me know how am I doing on time now?
You're doing great. I think maybe another 15 minutes. Is that
wonderful? Okay,
great.
great. Yeah, that works perfectly. So, much like Booker T. Washington's conclusion that, quote, the Negro has much to learn from the Jew, Zionist educators also argued that Mizrahim had much to learn from the African-American experience. So, for example, in 1951, Jerusalem educator Deborah Kalin attempted to establish a school for underprivileged Mizrahi youth that was modeled after Booker T's Tuskegee Institute. By the 1960s, Israel's Moshavim, or farmers' cooperatives, largely populated by Mizrahim, were being used as a model for establishing Black American Moshavim in the South of the US, a number of which still exist today in Mississippi and Alabama. What's fascinating about this little side note here is that this cooperative model, initially inspired by the Tuskegee, Alabama model, takes root in Israel, and then decades later, the Israeli government inspires Black farmers in Mississippi and Alabama. It's through this that we begin to understand the frequent references to Israel as a great sociological laboratory. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. used this term as well as Ida Jiggets, with Mizrahi Israelis acting as a test case in many ways for potential ways to improve the situation of global peoples of color. Okay, so back to Ida Jiggets, an American in Israel. Prior to her departure for Israel, she recalls that a group photo was taken of all the students. So most of the students were American Jews, white American Jews. She was the only Black person, I think one of two Christians who participated in it. In the photo that they were taking, she was deliberately cropped out of it, with the exception of her hand. So when she received the proof, she was like looking for her face or anything, and she couldn't find it. And she questioned the photographer, why is that? And he said, oh, well, it's because of we couldn't fit everyone in the photo there. I put a little arrow here so you can see that the only reason why her hand is in it is because it's resting on a white male student's lap. There are some other people that are back there. But then once the group arrived in Israel, an Israeli photographer asked to take her photo, to which she initially refused out of confusion, unless other students be included in the photo. He was kind of demanding that it was only her that should be in the photo and not the rest of the people. Eventually, her program director convinced her to take the photo, and it was distributed to newspapers throughout the world. On one hand, Jiggets is being intentionally excluded from American society, and on the other, she's being used as a kind of spectacle and marketed as, quote, the first Negro at Hebrew U. And this set the tone for how Jiggets navigated the complexities of global race relations, being literally put to the margins at home in the US while being placed at the center in Israel. Her book, Israel to Me, was published in 1957, and it was a result of that first trip. Throughout her memoir, she repeatedly mentions being mistaken for a Yemenite Jewish woman, but it's rarely clear how she vocally responded to it at the time. But for those interpolating her as such, it's telling that physical skin color attributes of Jiggets would make them confuse Yemenites with African Americans. For Jiggets, this mistaken identity reinforced her own affinity and sense of solidarity with Yemenite Jews in Israel. And she frequently mentioned this affinity within Black American newspapers. She noted that a lot of the children that she spoke to, the Yemenite Jewish children that she spoke to, were understood themselves as Black and actually wanted to move to the US in order to get away from being Black in some ways. So they kind of understood that it's really this question of time and place that marks someone racially rather than some kind of essence of their being. When she finished her dissertation called Integration and Absorption of the Yemenite Jews in Israel, it's much longer because, of course, dissertations in New York, she continued her life there and actually stopped working in academia for personal and professional reasons. But she continued to serve as a board member briefly at Hebrew U. And upon returning to Israel, she became a feature writer for the Pittsburgh Courier and Color Magazine, where she wrote on her experiences in Israel. So we can see it on the right-hand side, one of the Pittsburgh Courier articles, as a Black woman, as well as on the subject of Yemenite Jewish integration in Israel. Her publications, while painting a fairly rosy picture of integration efforts in Israel, influenced an entire generation of Black American perceptions of Israeli society by drawing striking parallels between the Black American and Mizrahi struggles. Generally speaking, Black Americans saw Israel as this kind of sociological lab and model for Black-white integration efforts that should be implemented in the US. We can see that so a decade later, there's a Chicago Defender article in 1964 about someone's tour of the Middle East, where they wrote, quote, "From Copts in Egypt to Oriental Jews in Israel, African Americans are becoming more and more aware that ethnic discrimination was a transphenomenal phenomena, and Blacks were, quote, not alone in feeling its sting," end quote. The sentiment is precisely what kind of drives my research. So I've talked a lot about how Mizrahim are kind of being interpolated not by themselves, and now I want to talk about how they actually understood their own Blackness. So by the 1960s, quite similar to African-American discourse in the US, Mizrahi rhetoric on their own struggle for equality grew more militant in nature during this period of time. We have the 1959 Wadi Salib rebellion against police brutality emerging, and then the creation of the Israeli Black Panthers in the 1970s. While it's becoming quite clear for many of them that the social inequalities between Ashkenazim and Mizrahim were just deepening with time. And we can see this in one newspaper called Israel's, or bulletin called Israel's Oriental Problem, where someone writes that, quote, "The days are over when the Orientals would gratefully thank their European masters for any little morsel thrown to them in the form of another Uncle Tom in the Knesset. There is growing instead the feeling that we don't want any favors, but rather demand what is ours by right. Whiteism breeds Blackism." And this paper is written in Jerusalem in English. So these are direct quotes. Sorry, 1965. In a similar vein, following the Los Angeles Watts Rebellion, one Mizrahi intellectual warned that if segregation and police brutality against Mizrahim in Israel continued, Israel would see the same kind of rebellion taking place in the peripheral town of Kiryat Melachi, which conveniently translates from Hebrew to the City of Angels. He then pleaded with American Jewry in particular, who were, albeit mostly of European origin, fighting alongside Black civil rights leaders in the US to, quote, fight the very same struggle going on in Israel. And that using the Black protest anthem stating that, quote, "we," meaning Mizrahim, too shall overcome. By the 1970s, we have a group of Moroccan and Iraqi Israeli youth inspired by the Chicago and Oakland chapters of the Black Panthers in the US, forming the Israeli Black Panthers. They're a politically diverse group of youth activists, but their organization marked this pivotal moment in intra-Jewish racial history, in which both Israeli elites and international media were faced with a highly visible and effective civil rights group highlighting discrimination against Afro-Asian Jewish Israelis. Their protests range from symbolic burying of discrimination and racism, as you can see on the left-hand side. These are coffins with the word discrimination written on it, to a Robin Hood program where milk was taken from wealthy neighborhoods and distributed to impoverished and malnourished Mizrahi families. Notably, in 1974, 1975, Black Panther activists like Shalom Cohen and Dani Sahel took tours of Europe, particularly France, where considerable number of Jews from North Africa and the Levant resided. While there, they pressed for European Jews from North Africa to advocate for their brethren who were living in Israel and fought alongside them in their struggle against institutionalized discrimination. Some even went as far as to call for assistance for Afro-Asian Jews to migrate from Israel. Interestingly enough, members of the Arab League took heed of such calls for immigration and led a campaign from 1975 to 1978, inviting Israeli Jews from places like Morocco, Sudan, Egypt, Yemen, and Iraq to return to, quote, their rightful homeland in the Arab world. While seemingly absurd, sorry, there's more images of the Black Panthers. I forgot about that. People did actually take them up on this. And I want to briefly mention these Lost Jerusalem tapes that I discovered in Chicago several years ago, which are kind of lost footage of Black Panthers kind of giving a tour to an American Jewish person of Jerusalem. And there's one really great scene in this footage where a woman with several children named Aisha says that I don't want protexia, which is preferential treatment. I want justice. Why? Because today you have it and tomorrow it's gone. And I think that's a really great sentiment to kind of think through in terms of the Mizrahi struggle in particular. So when the Arab League invited Jews, particularly from Israel, to return to their homelands, they put out ads in newspapers throughout the world, including the New York Times. What you see here is that ad from 1975, where it's like a kind of quarter page ad. I don't know how much money they spent on this, but it seems absurd, right? This is given a time in which Saddam Hussein is now in power, and there's the Revolutionary Council, which has a very long and infamous history. But in fact, some Iraqi and Moroccan Jewish families took it upon themselves to migrate from Israel to their countries of origin. One of the more infamous instances of this were of Yosef Nawi and David Morduk, both Iraqi Israelis. To the left-hand side, you see Yusuf and Dorit, his wife. They left the country to Baghdad with their children. And while there, he gave a press conference for Iraqi national radio denouncing the treatment of Mizrahim in Israel and the institutionalized racism existent in the country. A few years later, we have something similar. I'm not able to identify who this person is specifically, but it's an interview transcript that was found in the Iraqi Jewish archives, which are housed in the US. These archival materials were all found in a flooded basement in the Mukhabarat agency of Saddam Hussein, the internal spy agency. And so some of them are kind of ripped up. This is one of the better pages, I must say. But it involves a radio interview with a man by the name of Dawood Yamin Morduk, that he explains in 1978 that he returned to Iraq after spending several years living in Zionist hell, as he put it. And he began his interview by expressing his appreciation for being able to return to his Jewish homeland of Iraq. Interestingly enough, his main critique of Israeli society was this feeling of a kind of double consciousness or blackening in certain ways among Mizrahim who are not treated as Israelis or Israeli Jews, but as, quote, an Israeli Jew from Iraq, Egypt, Tunis. But in Iraq, he could feel that he felt as if he was living freely as a Jew and as a citizen like other people. When reporters for our audits interviewed those Moroccan Jews who had already packed their bags. So this is in the summer now of 1976, where about 128 families had already started packing their bags to leave for Morocco. Haaretz interviewed some of the people, and they were quite explicit in their intentions and reasoning for immigration. One person by the name of Jacques said that the main point is that we're thought of as third-class citizens, Ezrachim Sug Gimel. The Ashkenazim established against us a regime of harassment and persecution, of arrests without reason, a regime of white and wealthy rule over Black and poor. And he continued by explaining the lack of access to resources available to Mizrahi Jews by saying to the reporter himself, "You are a white Ashkenazi, all you have to do is pick up the phone and you'll receive everything." In addition, his uncle pointed out in stronger terms, this quote here, that the reason why he's leaving is that we've had enough of this country. 28 years we put up with you Ashkenazim, and we didn't become affluent from the riot. So he's referring here to what is Salib in 59, the Black Panthers, that the Blacks did against the whites. So now we're saying, thanks, that's enough. We're going back to Morocco. Albert's statement, the person who said this, not only points not only to the usage of migration as a tool of protest, similar to that of the Great Migration of Black Americans up north, but to the legacy of racialization of Mizrahim and the place that 1959 and Israeli Black Panthers holds in the history of intra-Jewish relations in Israel. And I'm going to wrap up in like 5 minutes. Am I good on that one? Great. Cool. Thanks. We can see something similar in more contemporary practices. So I just wanted to show this comic or cartoon strip on the left-hand side where two men who are kind of marked as Mizrahi men for a variety of different reasons. One on the right says, "Once we were the oppressed Blacks here," and the one on the left says, "Until the Ethiopians came and screwed us over," with presumably Ethiopian Jews in the background protesting against saying things like enough with racism, enough with discrimination, and things like that. I like this cartoon particularly because it does show this tension between Blackness within Israel at this moment in time, in which Mizrahim have always been the kind of Black Jews of Israel in many ways. And with Ethiopians, at least with the second generation, they are also considered Black and living in very similar towns and similar conditions as Mizrahim. So there is a slight tension there with that taking place. Another thing to note is this map that I promised earlier. So this is a map. On the right-hand side is of Tel Aviv, and on the left-hand side is of the south of the country. And it shows where Afro-Origin Jews, where there's 50% or more of them, or a majority of Afro-Asian Jews. If it's in red, then there's 70% or more. And greenish blue, I'm colorblind, so I think it's one of those colors, means that it's a majority. So we can see that Tel Aviv has no color, excuse the pun. And in the south, very similar to if we put these right on the map with where the Mabarot were, we see the same kind of layout here where we have huge, large streams of red, which means that there's 70% or more of Afro-Origin Jews living there. And by that, I mean North African and Ethiopian Eritrean Jews as well. Okay. Something that I've been working on recently, partially due to the state of the Israeli state archives at the moment, which are fairly inaccessible, and partly out of my own interest, is kind of poetry and poet activists who are kind of thinking about these questions that I'm also thinking about, right? And can probably articulate it much better than I can in some ways. On the left-hand side, we have Yossi Sabari, and on the right, Orit Teshuma, both Black identified artists. Orit Teshuma is from the Beta Israel Ethiopian community, and Yossi Sabari is a Yemenite Jew. Many of which the artists that I'm talking about are influenced by Black intellectuals like Frantz Fanon, Patricia Hill Baker, and W.E.B. Du Bois. And what they're doing is they continue to interrogate notions of diasporic belonging, issues of double consciousness, and Blackness for Israeli Jews. Writing as Black men, women, and queer folks, these poets interrogate race and racism in ways that resonate well with current transnational conversations of race and Blackness. And so I just want to conclude with an example from Adi Kassar, who is a founder of Ars Poetica, which is a play on words between Horace Mann's poem and a derogatory term for Mizrahi. In her poem called White Lies, or Shekarim Levanim, she is having a conversation with presumably a white Ashkenazi man. And so she says to him that you said money doesn't have any color. We've seen that the impoverished do, though. For you, you say, for you, everything is in black and white, but you're the one who put these glasses upon my eyes. Looking in the mirror, I see a black woman who you caused to be embarrassed by the color of her skin. When you were a kid, let's play doctor and patient. Who is the sick one, me or you? I really love this poem because there's an aspect of it in which implicitly there's an argument that there's a post-racial Israeli society in some ways. And there's also this argument that oftentimes come up in the US is, why are you talking about race so much? Maybe if you stop talking about it, it'll go away. And for her, she's saying, you know, if there's a doctor and patient game, I'm trying to fix the problem. I'm trying to heal society by actually bringing up these issues. And you're the sick one by trying to pretend like they don't exist. Right. And so to conclude in a way, by looking at all of these, what I hope to do is to really complicate assumptions of an inherent whiteness of Jews and Israelis. And that would allow us to really revisit with a more critical and informed eye notions of a fixed category black-white, Arab-Jewish, binary modes of thinking, and moves us to a more nuanced understanding of racial constructs as spatial temporally fluid. That's what I've done in this presentation, is show you how Jewish, Black, and Israeli history have a shared connection by providing a completely different story of Israeli society that is centered not on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or Black-Jewish relations in the US, but on how one marginalized group, the Mizrahim, can learn from another, African Americans, and vice versa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Roby. That was incredibly fascinating. And I myself have several questions, but I wanted to first turn to my students to see if any of them would like to pose any questions. And then, and also just encourage all of you who are here to please, if you have any questions, type those into the Q&A box. Galit, please.
Yeah, hi, Professor Roby, thank you so much for the incredible presentation. One question that I have, and one question that I feel like we encounter like very frequently, like in the recent weeks, frankly, but you know, coming up to this point in history is like how accurate, how helpful, how constructive is it to try to like understand the situation with, you know, like racial, cultural, historical tensions in Israel through this, like through a lens that like feels parallel to the US one? Because like one thing that, I don't know, I think about myself a lot and like talk to like people about, I guess, is like the notion, like as you touched on, like the notion of race, the notion of like yeah, like it is like very different in Israel than it is in the US and like in other parts of the world. So like, do you have any thoughts on like what lessons are universal, what lessons aren't, like what can we learn from each situation, and how can we apply the things that we learn in one situation to another, or can't we? And sorry, it's a bit all over the place, but yeah.
I think I get what you're trying to say. So like, I think, you know, what's important is that we don't equate one with the other. We can see similarities and parallels between them, but those are parallels, right? Parallels work like that, not like this. And it's so important when we talk about race to really have a good knowledge of the society itself, right? We can say, like if I just threw out the term Blackness in Israel, that doesn't give you a context of actually what I'm talking about, right? You would need to have that, you know, detailed understanding of why, let's say, an Iraqi Jew is a Black person, even if they might not look Black in American eyes, right? Or the case of Brazil, why, you know, people in the same family have completely different races, right? You know, a mother can produce, even though, you know, the mother and father of one race, they can produce a child that's of a different race. because race is quite fluid. And I think that's one of the more universal things, both over space and time, that we like to pretend that it is determined by birth and that, it's biological, it's obvious in some ways, but in reality, it's not. Even in the US case, I know I can think of people's family history where, in one census, someone is defined as mulatto, and then in the next census, they're defined as Negro or Black, right? And so then, of course, erasing an entire family history, you're doing that. But that's all to say that, it's very problematic when there is a kind of thin or superficial understanding of a society. And then you see one kind of, similar thing and kind of jump on that. I think that's a problem. Yeah, I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Stav, yes. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for coming. This is really interesting. And just following up on Galit's question. So what do you think, there's this need to put those construct in the Israeli society and kind of perceive all Jews in Israel as just white? Because I feel like there's just not movement, but direction of just painting Israel in a certain way. And that kind of undermines the struggles and the identity and the heritage of the Jews who are Black or Mizrahi, who identify themselves not as white and have not been treated as white. So from an American perspective, I'm just wondering why there's a need to make Jews white.
Yeah. Yes, that is a great question that I think I ask myself every day. And I think that part of it is that this early Zionist engagement with scientific racism. In many ways, a lot of the Zionist leadership, not all, but a lot of the Zionist leadership wanted to present Jews as white, white and Western, normal people, right? And that really, that kind of drive really did continue into the state, in which, how the state kind of markets itself as a Western, implicitly white society to others, while understanding that, not all Jews are white in that sense. And that comes across, even today when we think about, if you take a look at, I don't know, IDF tweets and things like that, who is presented as the ideal soldier. So that goes back to the new Jewish man in many ways, and woman in some ways. If we think about, with the exception of musicians, and that's kind of the same thing in the US, interesting enough, that Black musicians are presented to the world, but not Black culture or anything else in many ways. So the same thing happens in Israel, where, the kind of presentation, or at least how it markets itself to the world, is that kind of, who we see on TV or on movies are people who present as white, right? And that goes with this early 20th century German Jewish kind of need for whiteness in some ways, or desire for whiteness. And I think for others, it helps, and I'm speaking of non-Israelis, non-Jews, it can be problematic in some ways, and I think it does kind of help to frame it initially, to understand it, to understand what's going on in a country that they may not know as much about, right? So if you kind of put it in these stark terms of okay, it's a white state, it's a white society, then you can start already kind of putting in your own pieces of the puzzle rather than looking more into it and seeing what that's about, right? Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. Sam, did you have your hands up? Or Griffin?
Yeah, I had a quick question, but if Griffin wants to go first, it's all good. Or
how about you go first, and then
okay.
Griffin can go afterwards.
Sounds great. Well, thank you so much for talking to us today. It was really a pleasure. I was just curious if you could talk a little bit more about, I guess, the relationship and tension, as you kind of hinted to, between the first wave of Mizrahi immigrants, and then the second wave of Ethiopian immigrants, and how that plays out today in Israeli society.
Yeah. So I'll start out by saying, just because a community is Black doesn't mean that they are not racist against other Black and brown people in that sense, right? Of course, racism has to do with power and structure and things like that. And so there is, with the first generation of Mizrahi Jews, in a sense, right? There are already hierarchies in place in Israeli society where, Iraqi Jews were thought of as the intellectuals, Moroccan Jews are kind of at the low rung of that, being very African or Berber, meaning Amazigh, indigenous peoples. And so that was already kind of in place. And so, but with the establishment with the Israeli Black Panthers, there was a big argument against the migration of Soviet Union Jews, particularly because there was a fear that Golda Meir in particular was bringing them in order to whiten the state. When Ethiopian Jews come, it's at the same time that the Soviet Union is collapsing. And there's a lot of former Soviet Union, FSU, non-Jews and Jews who moved to Israel for a variety of different reasons alongside Ethiopians. Ethiopians are placed in the same regions, in the same towns and cities in the south and the north as Mizrahim who live there. And so there's, I don't want to call it labor tensions, but there's, this sense for Mizrahi Jews who may want to be socially mobile to kind of step on the foot or step on the backs of, these poor backwards Ethiopian newcomers in that sense, right? So it's kind of a treatment, how people learn how to treat new migrants in some ways. But then also it comes with an internalized racism that comes into play, something that Frantz Fanon talks a lot about, this kind of epidermalization or internalized racism where you kind of taught to hate yourself and then anyone who looks like you or may, be adjacent to you. How that plays out now is curious. I can't say too much about it because I am a historian, so I don't want to step on anyone's toes or really actually, say the wrong or inaccurate thing. But I am thinking particularly about someone's comment after Solomon Teka was murdered or killed, shot, that Ethiopian Jews were protesting, and one Mizrahi Jew wrote something like, "Where were you during the our protest?" and things like that. It was quite shocking that this person said that, but there's that tension of well, why weren't you with us when we had a problem? Should we join you? Are we part of the same community in some ways? And I think that's something that people are still working out. It's a process of boundary making. I think that's where the tension is coming into play, where it's well, are Ethiopian Jews, many of the youth talk like Mizrahim in some ways or dress like as well. Are they part of us? Is there a line that needs to be drawn? People don't know. It's a process in play right now.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. Griffin, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I've thank you so much for the talk. It's been really good. My question is that I've spent a good amount of time in Israel and with Israelis, and I get the impression that a lot of these issues with Mizrahi integrating into Israeli society were really in the first few decades of Israel, and that these problems have, for the most part, gone away, and that most Israelis, if you talk to them our age, they don't really see the differences of Mizrahi or Ashkenazi, because so many people are mixed, and it just seems like there's just one Israeli culture. So I want to ask, how have the conditions improved for Mizrahim in Israel, and how have they not? Or what things have also remained the same? And then also I want to kind of ask why you think so many Mizrahim, if they were so supportive, or if there was Black Panther movements, and it seems more coming from the left wing, and whenever I was reading your book, you were talking a lot about the communist movements within the Mizrahi in Israel. So I'm wondering why nowadays Mizrahim seem to generally vote more on the right wing in Israel.
Yeah.
And
okay.
if it had to do with the Labor Party being in power for so long during those first few decades.
Yes, for sure. I would say that, the Mapai Party was the problem. And Gahal was as well, but that's a side note. But the Mapai part for Mizrahim, they were the problem. And so, you try to just go with the opposite of that, right? To find a solution in some ways. I don't know if that, I'm not going to comment on whether or not that is effective, but I think that was the mindset, at least with the 1977 a great upheaval or revolution with the shift from labor to likud in that sense. The first question you asked about like intermarriage and mixing and things like that, I think that's something, well, I know that that's something that it's a rhetoric that's been in play since the 1950s, actually. So even in the 1950s, people were saying that like, oh, okay, it'll be cool. The next, people are already marrying each other, Poles with Iraqis, and things like that. So the next generation, it'll be fine since we're mixing. And first, I want to be more explicit about using the term, intermarriage. It's quite curious because we are talking about marriage between Jews, right? And so in the context of like the US or Europe, if you say intermarriage, you're talking about Jews and non-Jews, right? So it's, it's something that people really need to think more about, that we do say this term intermarriage to mean marriage between Jews and Israel. But it's also important to acknowledge that that really didn't fix much of anything. By the 1960s, a lot of people that I wrote about are already saying that this is not the case. That is not an effective solution, and it's not happening, right? I think it really depends on who you ask in Israel, regarding what they'll say, whether or not the situation in Mizrahi have improved or not. And there are some really cool documentaries. I think some of them have subtitles, I'm not sure. But one is Arsim Fechot, I think, which talks about gender performance of Mizrahim, men and women. And there's another one where I can't recall the name of it, but they interview some high school kids. And they ask them, they're from like, a southern town in Israel. So Mizrahi, they ask them, what are you? Where are you from? And not one of them said the town. They all said Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt. And then the interviewer asked, oh, is that where you were born? And they were like, no. Oh, so your parents were born there? Like, no. My like great grandparents or my grandparents were born there. It's quite curious, like that, thinking about that feeling that you have been born in a country, but you don't necessarily think that you're part of it, that you're part of some other diasporic, country in that sense, that, Israel is made up of like lots of overlapping diasporas in that case. Whereas, let's say, unless they're Romanian or something, most Ashkenazi Israelis would just say, yeah, I'm Israeli, right? In that case. So that's something to think about, to kind of, complicate a little bit that notion that things are okay now. There's still a huge problem with academia, as it is in the US. There are very few scholars or professors in prestigious institutions in Israel who are of non-European origin. And even for political parties, for the most part, although many do nowadays, over the past, I guess, 20 years or so, there are more Mizrahim in political parties, but not at the head of them in that sense.
Great. And Stan has a question, but I just wanted to quickly add a question related to what you said, that's something I've been curious about as a Mizrahi person myself who spent time in Israel. And like in your book, you talk about the discrimination within the educational sphere that Mizrahi Jews experience upon coming to Israel, especially with the issue of like channeling Jews into vocational, tracks rather than what they were used to prior to coming to Israel. But what I'm curious about is, do you see that sort of discrimination persist today, as far as like within the curriculum? Is there still a lack of concentration on the experience of the Jews of the Islamic or Muslim majority world? And just kind of like, if you could reflect about what that discrimination looks like within the educational sphere a little bit.
Yeah, so I know maybe it was a long time ago, but I remember there was this, someone wrote an article about what the curriculum was like, and they were looking for the pages that talked about non-European Jews, and there was like 3 little pages in a like very, very thick book. Someone made a piece of artwork out of it, which I thought was really great. I'm pretty sure that still continues. Although the Biton Commission may have changed things a little bit, but there's still kind of a lack of representation of non-European Jewish history worldwide, to be honest. It's not just an Israeli issue, it's also an issue in American and European academia. France to a lesser extent, though, because of the colonial legacy. In terms of the kind of tracking that goes on, it still is somewhat of a problem today, whereas so the way that you go to university is through Bagrut, matriculation.
He's frozen for all of us, right?
What's that?
You're frozen for a few seconds.
Oh, am I back?
You're
Yes.
back. The last thing you had mentioned was the Bagrut, the matriculation. That's the last thing I heard.
Oh, wow, okay. Okay. Bagrut, and so still to this day, there isn't many of the schools in the South don't prepare high school students in the South to actually, take those exams. And so if you're not prepared to take the exam, then you're definitely not going to go to like Hebrew U or Tel Aviv University. So it's kind of an implicit, less explicit way of kind of tracking people. A organization called Hila, which I, was briefly involved in, does actually try to address that by teaching Ethiopian and Mizrahi origin families how to assert themselves within the educational system and actually how to prepare independently for going to university. So there still is that issue at play, less egregious as it was back in the 60s and 70s, but it's still at play today.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Stan.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. The majority of Israeli high school graduates go into the military, and they come from all backgrounds, and they spend a couple of years together. Doesn't that help in terms of mixing all peoples of different backgrounds? And doesn't that last once they get out of the military?
So unfortunately, it doesn't. That is the kind of, so the IDF is meant to be a kind of absorption mechanism and integration mechanism, but there's also a bit of tracking that goes on in the process of recruitment. Does that make sense? Recruitment? Yeah. So during the process of recruitment, sometimes interviewers, if your ethnicity is ambiguous and you're Jewish, they'll ask, okay, well, where are your parents from? If you say Israel, they'll ask, where are your grandparents from? Until they get to your ethnic origins or your Edah in that sense. And oftentimes, so there's like a black unit and a white unit, Golani and the Sanchanim, the paratroopers unit. And those are like stereotypically, although there are, of course, Ashkenazim and also Americans in Golani, Golani being a stereotypical kind of Mizrahi unit. And so even in that pivotal moment, they're mostly surrounded by people of, same socioeconomic background, as well as ethnic origins, or even regional origins in that sense. And that translates into, let's say, that's your friend network for most of your life, or at least most of your adult life, right? The people that you meet in an army unit are the ones that are like your, adopted brothers or sisters in that sense. And so that ends up reinforcing itself in society itself, right? Yeah.
Okay, great, thanks. So we have about another, like a little less than 10 minutes. I'm sure you're feeling really tired by this point, Bryan, but we have several questions and also just like words of praise because everyone seems to have enjoyed this talk. So I'm just gonna bring up a couple of them right now and we'll see, how many we can get to. So Scott Lankford asks, he says, thanks for the eye-opening presentation. In the US academic and media circles, there's been a growing rediscovery, reassessment of the Black Panthers recently. Has there been any similar rediscovery, reassessment in Israel?
Yes and no. I would say that, so one thing that's really great for the Israeli case is that recently the Black Panther Agadah, back in the 70s, they created this Agadah for Pesach, for Passover, through the Black Panthers that was kind of like satire in this like very traditional kind of North African way of doing things. And that's been rediscovered and I think will be translated, or the translation will be finished next month into English. So I would look out for that. In terms of kind of a evaluation and reassessment of the Black Panthers, there hasn't been that much or as detailed, and definitely not as detailed as it has been for the Chicago or the Oakland chapters over the past 10 years in the US. One of the big issues with that is that, of course, some of its leaders are still alive. Another large issue is that the Israel state archives are effectively closed, except for 1% of their data, which are digitized. And I think for Israeli academics, there's an assumption that, oh, well, we already know about the Panthers, but we actually don't know that much. We know a little bit here and there about, people's stories and things like that, but there hasn't been as detailed of a historically distant study of the Black Panthers in Israel. There have been, of course, studies during the time in the 70s, as well in the 80s and 90s, but not as detailed as it should be. And I think one thing that people really should interrogate if they decide to pursue such a study is to look at gender dynamics. I know Raz Yosef has written a little bit about this with the iconography of the Black Panthers in Israel, kind of appropriating this kind of hyper-masculine stance, as well as the rhetoric that they used. But, looking at their leaders and even the activists within the Panthers, the only woman I can really think of is Mazal Sael, who's Danny Sael's partner at the time. There wasn't that much of women's representation within the Black Panthers, and that definitely did flavor how they presented themselves, how they presented Mizrahi history, which is kind of, so things like that do need to be complicated in many ways, as well as getting a further or more detailed understanding of their political diversity within the Black Panthers itself. It's not just a radical left movement. By many of the leaders, yes, like Kochavi Shemesh, but for people who are involved with it, some were fairly right-wing already then, right? But still advocated with and for the Black Panthers. I think that I think there was another question that I might have skipped, or no? Let me how do I find that? I'll assume that I answered the question.
Yeah, I marked it as answered. I think, yeah. But of course, I should just say that for any of you, I'm not going to be able to we won't be able to get to all these questions, but feel free to contact us or Dr. Roby individually, and I'm sure we'd be able to help you out. So there are several more questions. One is actually by a PhD student at Stanford, Marva, and I think actually you address this. It's about the tensions between Mizrahi and Ethiopian Jews. But did you want to add anything more to that? Marva actually works on Ethiopian Jews in Israel.
Yes, so. She does a fantastic job with it. No, I would say Marva is probably more qualified than I am to comment on that.
Okay, then I'll ask you a kind of easier question. So one of an anonymous attendees said, I am absolutely fascinated by your research. When is your second book coming out? I'm not sure if you have an answer to this.
3 years, maybe.
Okay. And lastly, this is a pretty broad question, so I don't know if you'll be able to tackle this in a couple of minutes, but Vaughn Harrison says, living in Israel in the 70s, I found that when there was a peace between Israel and its neighbors, then tensions between white and Black Israelis became more evident. During wartime, Israelis felt they couldn't afford to be divided. Do you agree?
Yeah, to a certain extent, I would say that, there's this argument that or people make a joke that, we do need to keep the conflict up because otherwise we'll just kill each other, meaning that, the tensions between Mizrahim and Ashkenazim, as well as different socioeconomic classes in Israel, would bubble over into something quite large, were it not for a larger conflict at play. There's a little bit of truth to that in a tongue-in-cheek fashion. But I think also that the voices of people who do try to fight for, equality of all citizens of Israel within Israel, who live within the recognize boundaries and things like that, that their voices tend to be diminished when there is, a larger conflict at play. They're still talking, right? But we just don't hear them as loudly until, there's a sort of peaceful moment. So I would want to give the impression that like everyone just kind of like says, okay, well, let's forget about these little things here, because they're not little, right? They're pretty big issues at play. But it's more that we don't hear their voices as much when there's a larger conflict.
Great, thank you so much. We'll leave it at that. Just again, this was fantastic, and best of luck with your, with your future or with your second book project. Thank you so much.